All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session. Just going to give everyone a few minutes to come into the room. I'm going to get us started with an acknowledgement of country, and then I look forward to introducing Nick Eckstein to you, who is on your screen. Hopefully you can see Nick already.
Hello, everyone.
All right, Nick, I do like to start on time and people can watch the recording if they're a little bit late. So let's get started straight away. So
Yes, indeed.
excellent. So I would just like to start with the acknowledgement. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you, everyone. I am coming to you, in fact, from the land of the Eora Nation, and I suspect Nick knows his country that he is coming to.
I do indeed. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri land on the territories of the Kulin Nation.
Lovely. It is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and to be particularly is a pleasure to be with Nick as well. I have known Nick for quite some time. I don't care to do the maths on that.
It's about 25 years, Kathleen.
About 25 years. There you go. That's the maths on that. It is a real pleasure, in fact, to be chatting to you today about Florence and about the tour that you're leading to Florence in November for Limelight Arts Travel. Because, of course, the very first tour that I ever assisted on was a tour where you were the tour leader and I was your tour manager, your assistant. So it's not an exaggeration to say that what I know about tour leading, I learned from you. So in fact, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk.
I will immediately reciprocate by saying that one of the reasons that tour ran so smoothly is because you were not just a courier and organizer, but a co-leader. So that is a very fond memory of mine, that trip.
Mine too. And I have to say, I mean, we're talking today about your tour in November of this year, but I have to say, when we were working on putting this tour together, that experience that we had some 20 years ago, more than that, 22 years ago, yes, was in my head when we were structuring this trip to Florence. So I want to start firstly because not everyone who's attending today will be familiar with you and with your distinguished research and teaching history. So I just want to start by letting people know, and you can highlight any additional points you'd like to, that of course you have a very distinguished teaching career, principally at the University of Sydney, but also at Monash University, where you did your PhD with one of Australia's foremost historians of the Renaissance in Italy, Bill Kent. And that you also have a research profile that relates to the social history of Florence during the Renaissance, particularly to one district of the city. And more recently, you've become known for the research that you've done on one site in that district of the city, which is, of course, the Brancacci Chapel. So that's how I would, and the other thing that I would add, which I know again from personal experience, not as a student, but as someone who tutored for you, is that of course you're also a very highly respected teacher from your time at the University of Sydney, where you won a number of teaching awards, as well as competitive research grants for your skills as a communicator and an educator. So these were the reasons why we thought of you as someone well qualified to lead a tour to Florence, but maybe you'd like to just pick out some aspect of your expertise as well. Are you happy with how I've summed it up?
I'm more than happy with what you said, but if I can expand on a point, if you like,
please.
Which is that everybody will be familiar with what is said every time the Olympics come around, which is that Australia as a nation punches above its weight in terms of sporting performance. And if you ever look at the statistics, we discover this is actually statistically just not true. The thing that people don't tend to realize is that in the field of pre-modern European history, so this includes ancient, medieval, Renaissance, early modern,
mm,
right up to the 18th, 19th century and beyond. But I'm just talking about pre-modern Europe. Australia has, for a half a century now, genuinely punched above its weight. And one of the abiding, if minor, frustrations is that the people who know least about this are Australians themselves. So you referred to Bill Kent, who
mm,
died tragically early in his 60s, about a decade ago. Um, he wasn't just one of Australia's leading Renaissance scholars, he was one of the
mm,
path-breaking scholars in the world
mm,
in the field of Renaissance Florence. And Australia was actually famous, still is,
mm,
um, but particularly in the 70s and 80s and 90s for the work done on Renaissance Italy, and particularly in Florence, because that
mm,
was one of the major foci. And this is in large measure due to Bill and his former wife, Dale Kent, who's still alive and retired now in Melbourne, and their work on social structures. And we probably talk a little bit about this. Friends, relatives, and neighbors. What they did was a lot to explode the old-fashioned notion of the Renaissance being the first modern age, the first, and that, for that reason, the idea of its being the first modern individualistic
mm,
male kind of modern age. That we owe very much to the work done by Kenson and a number of other scholars around the world. And so, just to finish, a little vignette. One of the first things that would happen when you went to do your PhD research in Italy, everybody would meet everybody, lots and lots of American scholars, as well as British and European, of course, but the Americans were probably greatest in number. And one of the early games that would be played is to ask, well, who's your advisor? Their word for a supervisor. And so I was asked that question, and I said, oh, Bill Kent at Monash. And all of them, this happened again and again, said, what's he like?
mm,
Uh, because he had such an enormous reputation. And happily, I was able to report that as well as being a wonderful scholar and a fantastically beautiful writer, he was the kind of person you would most want as a mentor. And so I
mm,
had a very a long-standing relationship with him, and referred to in my first book using the German word for a supervisor, Dr. Vater, which is he was my father doctor. Uh,
mm,
all of the things that you associate with that term were true of him. So
mm,
when it came to look around the world where one might study Renaissance Italy, you looked at all of the Ivy League universities in the US and so on. And then inevitably, because you lived just up the road from Monash, you thought, oh, for heaven's sake, Melbourne was the place to be. Australia, in many ways, still is if you're doing this kind of work.
mm. And I mean, one of the beautiful things about doing, you're a historian, you're a social historian, my PhD was in a different area, but one of the beauties of doing that kind of sustained research was, of course, that you got to go and be in the city and do primary research in Florence, as you did in a number of the city's excellent archives. You've spent time living in Florence. You've also spent time in Florence as a research fellow at the almost kind of heavenly world of Villa Tatti, Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies in the hills just outside Florence. So Florence is a place that you've lived and studied and done your research. You know it very well. I want to ask about this tour then with a bit of a polemical question. I don't need any convincing, but some people might. Given the things that we read about Florence being so overcrowded and so busy, and people queuing for bread rolls at lunchtime in the street, and the sites being so busy, why would we go back to Florence for this kind of concerted amount of time? Is it connected to that extraordinary research that's been done in Australia? What is it that draws us back to Florence?
There are certain canonical reasons why one would return, and there are, in a scholarly sense, more recent and compelling reasons. And I think that for both sets of reasons, which I'll explain in a moment, Florence is a place that you would want always to return. I would say similar things about Venice, of course, and obviously Rome. That it's not unique in this respect, though there are unique things about Florence. Most people in the English-speaking world, and this is true to this day, I think, who develop an interest in things Renaissance and in Italy have gone by way of early 20th century or late 19th century British appreciationism, as it has often been called. And that is the idea that I referred to a moment ago, this idea of Italy, Florence in particular, being the first, the place where the modern civilization of Europe is born, where the first modern, recognizably modern European citizens are to be found. We'll probably pursue that notion, and I'll say why I think it's absolutely wrong, but or rather misconceived rather than totally wrong. But in my own case, this was certainly the route that I took into Renaissance Italy by way of my parents, who did Renaissance Italy when they were undergraduates at Melbourne University in the 50s. And they loved Italy. And so when my brother and I were young, I was 14 and a half in 1975, they took us, my father had a period of leave, and we went to Europe and we spent 3 weeks in Italy. And that already did a lot of the damage, I think. But the reason we were there is because of the kinds of visions that you would get watching a film like Room with a View, or reading E.M. Forster's novels, or falling in love with the spectacularly beautiful artworks that are there. And there is no arguing with this, the kinds of objects, spaces, volumes, by which I mean the urban fabric and so on, the way the cities work in and around Florence and across Tuscany is breathtaking. So that's just a fact. And then there is this background of British love of Italy as well. If you go deeper, then you find the more you know, and I'm talking about anybody who has studied this from the 1970s and onward, you learn more and more that those ideas of a so-called Burckhartian Renaissance, I'll define that word in a moment, are very, very shaky indeed. Jacob Burckhardt was a Swiss mid-19th century scholar, a brilliant architectural historian, let's be very, very clear, a major scholar, a brilliant architectural historian, a brilliant historian of culture in the 19th century sense. And the idea of the Renaissance man, as we have it today, is is because he popularized it. He didn't coin it. That was an earlier Enlightenment French philosopher called Michelet. But it's because of Burckhardt that we think of the Renaissance man. And the more you look into this society, if you are lucky enough, as I was, to have been taught by people like Bill Kent and others, is that the capital R Renaissance kind of doesn't exist. But in pulling back that veil, you discover a more luminous, fascinating, half strange, half familiar reality, which is very, very different. And you start using the word medieval or late medieval a lot more frequently just to describe what you're discovering. It's important to realize that the Renaissance is a later coinage. This is people who are looking back through the filter of what happened afterwards. And really what Burckhardt is saying is that he's looking at the 15th century in Florence as the time when the wonderful liberal culture of 19th century Europe was born. So the Renaissance was wonderful because it produced us. And that continues into the 20th century, particularly in art history, which was slower actually. This happened a long time ago and it did sort of catch up, but for a long, long time, a lot of art historians were teaching that kind of aestheticized version of the modern Renaissance. The fact is that a couple of things Burckhardt said, that this is the great age of individualism. Well, you were nobody in this city if you weren't a friend, a relative, or a neighbor, because you lived cheek by jowl with people of all station, wealth, and so on all around you. Burckhardt said that women during this wonderful period lived, and I'm quoting directly, on a footing of perfect equality with men. And you are right to burst out laughing.
Writhe in my chair.
Yeah. So what we do actually is we cite a Renaissance aristocratic woman called Nanina Rucellai, who said, "Oh, do not be born a woman in this world if you want your own way." And in fact, in Florence, of all places, you would be better off actually in Venice as a woman in the 15th century than in Florence, because it was a particularly kind of toxic place for women. Lots of complications to be unpacked there. Why would you go there? Because you learn about a society in which you are nobody without the rest of the population. And what this means is that in coming to terms with the city, tourists or not, queues for panini or not, is that you become aware of a city that works in a particular way that fosters powerful neighborhood bonds, which are realized in urban form. I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that in a moment and why it works for an immersion tour like this. The word I would use to describe this tour is immersion. That in moving through the city, in understanding how, literally how the buildings are arranged in relation to each other, in walking into churches, you begin to get a picture of a city that is not an undifferentiated unit, but which is a jigsaw of overlapping tiny neighborhood communities. You are a citizen of your street and your neighborhood before you are a Florentine. And in certain ways, where you come from in terms of your neighborhood origin in this place matters much more than anything else. How do we pursue something like this as a group? Well, we can walk into off the Piazza of the Holy Trinity on the north side of the river in Florence, a beautiful piazza which is ringed by a Baroque church, which we're about to walk into, Renaissance palaces, including the Spini Palace right on the Arno, and various other palaces and so on. We can walk up the Via Tornabuoni towards the Palazzo Antinori. There are these great facades belonging to the families. But if you walk into that Baroque facade, the Holy Trinity Church, Santa Trinita, you will suddenly find yourself in a luminous, glowing medieval cavern around which are arrayed tombs belonging to the wealthy families of the neighborhood. If you then walk into a chapel belonging to the Sassetti family, which is at the end of the nave on the right of the chancel, you will find, people will probably know these paintings by an artist called Ghirlandaio, which show scenes from the life of Jesus, but also portraits of these families, because here is where they're buried. And the reason they're here is because they're neighbors. So in life, you interact with your neighbors, not always peacefully, not always affectionately, but you are perforce required to deal with your neighbors, relatives, and so on, if you're a Sassetti. And you find yourself being buried alongside these people in the church as well. So you get a kind of concentrated or a microcosmic version or representation of the neighborhood relations and the religious beliefs of the area of the city that you're in. You can repeat that experience in different ways as you move through the city. So doing this off the top of my head, we will do this actually with the group in this exact spot. If you walk out the front door of the Church of the Holy Trinity and you walk across the piazza, you find yourself at the opening of a narrow medieval street, a thoroughfare, one street in from the Arno, and parallel with it, called the Borgo Ognissanti, the street of All Saints. I can stop you a third of the way along the Borgo Ognissanti, where there is a tiny little piazza and a church tucked in on the side. It's called the Piazza del Limbo, the Piazza of Limbo. I'll explain why in a moment. And the church, the medieval church there, is dedicated to All Saints. It's called Piazza del Limbo because in the past there used to be a cemetery there where children who had not been baptized were buried. So they were in limbo, literally, as far as these people were concerned. Across from them is a clutch of palaces, now a hotel, belonging to one of the leading families in the area. And if you turn around, their neighbors are across the road. And then across the other side of that little alley are more palaces belonging to the same family. What we can there do is talk about the neighborhood relations in a tiny microcosmic neighborhood that belong to the same families we've just been visiting in the church, and talk about how this street came into being, quite literally, and how it changed over the period of decades and centuries. So what we're able to do, this is a feature of the kind of work that's been done on Florence, and the reason it's a wonderful place to go. Why do we go back? Because Renaissance historians are almost by instinct and have been for a long time, are interdisciplinary, and they don't just use documents, paper sources. They use the spaces of the city. They use the architecture of the buildings, the interiors of churches, and of course, the paintings and frescoes with which these buildings are filled, and which overflow into galleries like the Uffizi. So if I were to, I've already suggested a metaphor for this trip, that what we are not doing is a blue guide tour. We will not walk into the cathedral, metaphorically or genuinely, with a blue guide in hand and point out the number of monuments we won't, and how tall the church is and how long it took to be built. That's a very 19th century, indeed, blue guide way of thinking in terms of statistics and what's highest and what's longest and so on. Who is most famous? Blue Guide is born out of the 19th century Baedeker guides. So it really is straight back to the 19th century way of thinking, the Burckhardt way of thinking. We don't do that. What we do is immerse people in the culture that I'm describing to give people a set of skills that allow them to, and I use the word read deliberately, read the space, read the images with which they are surrounded, and begin to interpret how the Italian city works. Another thing I would say here is that this is very, very image and object heavy. Of course, we go to see, we go to encounter things in real three-dimensional space. And one of the things people coming on this trip will find is that we do not treat frescoes, altarpieces, and so on as static illustrations of the society. We regard them as part of a conversation. So what we have to try to do when we look at a cycle of frescoes like that in the Brancacci Chapel is to understand what might have been in the minds of 15th century men and women when they engaged with the subject matter. And there is one question you've hinted at on a list of things that we might talk about is there one exceptional thing that you would want to talk about? One place that you would never, never want to miss? One thing, if you could point it out. Now, there's total bias here. Me, it's the Brancacci Chapel. It has been a mecca for art historians, a canonical site for centuries. And there is an industrial quantity of art historical literature written about the Brancacci Chapel because it is seen as the place where the early Florentine Renaissance comes to life in paint for the first time, as painted by Masaccio, Fat Tom, Masolino, Thin Tom, and Filippino Lippi, Little Phil. So they could have been obviously Australian
Three
artists.
Stooges.
Yeah, so it has canonical status as far as art history is concerned. My work on the Brancacci Chapel stemmed out of that neighborhood culture, which was previously the sort of thing I worked on for my PhD. And because I studied as a PhD student the working class area around the church in which the Brancacci Chapel appears, it became obvious to me that things that were represented in the Brancacci Chapel had a lot to do with the working class neighborhood life of the district all around the Carmelite Church, where the Brancacci Chapel is. And so the book I ended up writing, which was a very, very long enterprise for reasons I won't bore you with, one of which is that there was no evidence. We can talk about that on the trip, perhaps. But the book was all about how working class people would have used this church, how women, actually aristocratic women for the most part, visited the chapel in order to venerate a miraculous image of the Madonna that was placed there in the early 15th century. What it tells us about the cult of Christian charity, mercy, and kindness that is at the heart of these societies. There's a surprise, perhaps. One of the things one might say about Renaissance Italy is that it's highly competitive, dog eat dog in many ways. There are very good reasons to see the origins of certain aspects of our capitalist society in this place. That's all true. It is also a place where exiling somebody without due process to a foreign country when they have committed no crime is unthinkable. And yes, there's a deliberate reference there, but I'm not being flippant. this is a society that believes that you measure the moral worth of the population in terms of the way you treat the weakest and the most
Mm,
vulnerable in that society. And it wasn't just a platitude. One of the source materials I used, one of the collections of documents I used from, as you know very well, Kathleen, was from local religious societies called confraternities, whose mission was to help poor people. There are depictions in the chapel, and there are scenes in the Brancacci Chapel which are based on on biblical passages from the Acts of the Apostles, which say that if you in the 15th century go and stand in the Brancacci Chapel, you are receiving lessons about good civics and how to be a good Christian and
mm,
a good human being. So they're not static illustrations. You would have very often been there with a priest whose job it was to say, you see this scene over here, see how it thematically connects with the one up there on the left, and now look down here. They didn't read them like pages in a book. They read
mm,
them as though they were an echo chamber of ideas to do with the ethical heart
mm.
of everyday life.
One
So
of the things, Nick, oh, sorry, no,
yeah, I need to be stopped at a certain point.
I do know this. I have the same difficulty. One of the things I was going to say, one of the things that I really liked about when we put this tour together was that, so you've got these kind of big name sites like the Brancacci Chapel, which people will have heard of because of the achievements of particularly Masaccio, but also Masolino and Lippi in that space, which in many ways, when you visit it, I mean, it's quite, because of the subsequent history of that building, really, it's a little bit of a drop down TARDIS from heaven of a
Yes.
moment
Yeah.
from the Renaissance, whereas the rest of that church that chapel is in is no longer like that. But you've put a number of places on the itinerary that are microcosms of that moment. I would also say of that late medieval moment in time, the ones that I'm thinking about in particular. There's three that come to mind for me, and I'll let you pick which one you might want to say something about. But I really loved that this tour goes, for example, to the Palazzo Davanzati, which has a kind of a difficult, I mean, you and I didn't get to go there 23 years ago because it was in that long restoration.
Yeah.
It's got a kind of a difficult opening hours. It's very little visited, but that's a museum that people may not know, a museum of domestic life in for the upper classes in Florence in the Renaissance or late Middle Ages, I would say. The other place that comes to mind, which is, I thought of it just now when you were talking about what animates the frescoes at the Brancacci Chapel in terms of charity, and that is the oratory of the Bonomini di San Martino in the center of town. I know I'm giving you a tough job. And the third place that came to mind in this sense of being a microcosm, it's a very big microcosm, is Santa Croce, where you kind of, that amazing church where you get to track from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance with a capital R, down to Mannerism and the High Renaissance, and kind of sliding into the Baroque as well. I loved that those three places on the itinerary repay a deep dive. You can spend a good amount of time in them. Some of them are big places like Santa Croce. The oratory of the Bonomini is very, very small. It's, one room where a lady still sits in the corner hand making lace. So why, I think you've already said why it was important to you to have those kind of places on the itinerary, but is there one of those places or a place like that on the itinerary that you think is a bit more special than, say, the Uffizi or the Accademia or those big collections that people are more likely to have visited on their previous trips?
Yes, never knock the Bargello, of course. As soon as you mentioned, no, for a particular reason,
No, when you
you
start listing, you're like, but also.
yeah, but you
Three.
mentioned that you can find cues in all sorts of places. The astonishing thing about the Bargello, which is one of the great sculpture museums in the
The
world, is that
world.
you don't
Yeah.
have to queue. When the Uffizi is packed to the gunnels, the same could be said of the Accademia in Venice. And mass
Yeah.
tourism is a very peculiar thing because
Yes, it
people go where
is.
they're told. They go where their guide tells them to go. I mean, their written guide.
Mm.
So everybody knows that Renaissance painting um, uh, began in Florence. We all know this. Woody Allen, before it was creepy to be interested in Woody Allen, we knew from one of his films everything you always needed to know about sex was, he said, we have to be, in the medieval scene, we have to be quick, he said, because soon the Renaissance will be here and we'll all be painting. So everybody knows that happened in Florence. So what does that mean for the Accademia in Venice? It means that, I remember the first time I took a group, I was petrified because I had seen the entrance, which is big enough for a couple of people to walk in. I thought, how does this cope with the on season? And the answer is nobody goes there.
No one goes. Yeah.
In Venice, you go to Piazza San Marco.
Mm.
In Florence, of course, you're going to the Uffizi because that's where the painting happens. And people don't think to go almost literally round the corner to the Bargello, which will be half empty, because that's where the sculpture is. It's a very strange thing. Anyway, so look, one could almost choose any of these sites in terms of what was your
Easy
question?
job. I don't even, to be honest, I don't remember. I'm so happy to chat about any of these places with you.
You mentioned Palazzo d'Avanzati.
I did.
The Bonome di San Martino and Santa Croce. The thing is, possibly subliminally, you've united three things which have got a huge amount in common. So in a way, we can talk about all of them. You can't miss Santa Croce if you go to Florence. You can't not go there. And that is because, in addition to its status as a kind of museum, as you say, of everything that we might want to talk about from the Middle Ages right up to the 19th century and beyond, it is a reflection, again, of one of the core things that defines people's identity in these places, which is, again, Franciscan charity in this case. I'll pause because I don't want to forget to say the thing that I want to say, and it's relevant here. Another reason, another part of the answer as to why you would go to Florence is because tours like this, and we did ours together in 2003. Before that, I had done about 25 of these in the 90s for university students, for students of the third age, that kind of thing. One of the things we always said, and something I imported into everything I taught of this nature at university, was the concentration on skills that stay with you after. So here's a promise that if you go on a trip like this, you won't just have things to remember. You will develop skills that will help you when you visit cities anywhere. One of the things I used to do in one of the units I ran was to ask people, I taught at the University of Sydney, even though I'm from Melbourne, as you know, so I would ask people to in an early tutorial, to define Sydney for strangers. I used to play a silly game and said, you have to imagine we've been invaded by aliens and you need to tell these people who know nothing about our culture the one thing that they need to know about Sydney. And it was always a fascinating exercise because everybody came up with a different answer. But these answers usually would arrange themselves thematically, so there was some commonality at the same time as that they were always unique. If you're going to play that game with the Italian city, you will find that there are distinct and unique features everywhere you go, and then there are patterns. And one of the things you will find in a place like Florence is that there are usually a small number of mendicant friaries. These are the medieval orders of preachers, Franciscans, Dominicans, various other ones, Augustinians, Carmelites. There are various different ones, but the dominant ones are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Dominicans, of course, being the defenders of orthodoxy and correct theology and so on. I'm being a little crude. The Franciscans being the people who expound the doctrine of charity, who say that a virtuous life lived in imitation of Jesus Christ, which means practicing charity, that thing I referred to before, is a form of prayer. And you will find you'll usually find the Dominicans and the Franciscans on opposite sides of the city, because they were so much into Christian charity that they hated each other. They had to be kept at a distance. But you will find the Franciscans and the Dominicans at one end. Then you will find a secular center of the city, Piazza della Signoria, which is where the town hall is.
Mm.
So you'll be able, we will visit, of course, the Piazza della Signoria, and we'll talk about how the government always had its seat on a big piazza like this. We will explain why the town hall is like a medieval castle designed for defense, literally. So that you have the secular heart. Then not far away, you will find that you have the religious heart of the city in the cathedral being coming from the word cathedra, which means that the bishop's throne was there. This is the house of the bishop. And of course, we've got the Duomo in Florence. So there are 4 coordinates that you will find in just about every other city of this kind. Then you'll find big thoroughfares, which tell you about how the city is opened up in Renaissance and more recent times. And you will find capillary-like alleys and laneways, which you will learn are the expression of the more organic way that medieval cities grew up, not unplanned, but in relation to function and purpose. And then there are more things in this way of talking as well, which include the art that is so much a centerpiece of a tour like this. And what you will end up with is a critical eye that will mean, again, another promise, you will never look at your home city quite the same way again. And the evidence to prove that contention is the number of students of mine who went and did honours theses, sometimes postgraduate work on this kind of thing in other fields. I had students who went, there was one who went and studied the town of Bendigo in Victoria, having based a lot of his analysis on Richard Trexler's book on public life in Florence, that great canonical work published in 1980. So these are generic kinds of observations that allow you to look at the way cities work in a way I suspect many people have never thought about before. So
To pick up on that point, Nick, I feel
yeah,
like that even is built into your program. I'm thinking that the tour
absolutely it is.
to
Absolutely.
start with, you go out from Florence and you go to San Gimignano, which people
Yep.
may know is, associated with that medieval, kind of earlier medieval period of self-governance that could be quite tricky to navigate
Yeah.
for the various political factions. But I'm thinking, as you were speaking now, that right at the end of the tour, you spend a day in southern Tuscany. You go obviously to Iris Arrigo's beautiful villa and garden, which we can just put to one side for the beauty that it is. But you spend the morning in Pienza, and as you were talking, I thought, well, that's kind of Pienza being a planned Renaissance town, and you can speak to that better than I can. But in a sense, the lessons that people will have gleaned from walking around Florence, which grew in different ways, not unplanned, as you say, but grew differently. Then when you get to Pienza, it kind of tiny little toy town example of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
I suppose you can read those lessons. People will be able, it's small, it's compact. They'll be able to read those lessons onto the streets of Pienza as they walk that town.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. Wasn't always great for the residents. This was a perfectly decent little agricultural and farming community in the middle of southern Tuscany. And the Sienese Pope, one of the great Piccolomini family, Pius II, moved in. It was his family seat, and he decided we can turn this into a Renaissance ideal city. And the hell with the locals. So what you've got is a peculiar kind of stage set. So you're walking through a little village, pretty little village, and then you come out on what becomes the main piazza, and all of a sudden, my goodness, there is a palace very like the the Palazzo Rucellai, which you'll be visiting in Florence, and you're thinking,
True.
what is that doing here? And why is there a communal palace which echoes the style? And why is there a family palace in the same style? And it's because of these grandiose visions of a 15th century Pope potentate who's got all sorts of designs on a European scale, imported into a little place like this. There's a great deal of, there's a lot of charity and genuine Christian belief and so on, and piety in this community, in this society. And then there's a great deal of overweening ambition, because the people really in charge are the ones to whom wealth clings most obdurately. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat the reality here. But to come back to those 3 sites, the Davanzati Palace is the glorious reconstruction of a 14th, 15th, it spreads over a period, but 14th through 16th century palace on many, many levels. Not all of the furniture and not all of the decoration you see there is from it, but it's been reconstructed very faithfully to be as it would have been at the time for a wealthy merchant elite family. And this is the kind of family that very likely would have had something to do with a confraternity like the so-called Good Men of San Martino. The Borromini di San Martino is an intriguing little place, because here you have another one of those confraternities. Most of them have a constituency they look after, so they might look after prisoners. They might pay dowries to poor girls who otherwise can't afford to get married. And the moral risk there is, of course, if you don't get married, you'll fall into prostitution. And if people fall into prostitution, then there won't be enough women around for the men, and the men are likely to turn into homosexuals. Now, I didn't just invent that sequence. That's actually why they're worried, particularly in Florence. There's a kind of moral panic about homosexuality, which is its own topic. But the Borromini di San Martino, as their constituency, are interested in well-to-do people who have fallen on hard times. And you've mentioned, we have, sorry, mentioned them in the itinerary, the poveri vergognosi, which means, translates as shame-faced poor. Because much worse than grinding poverty, of course, is for a family that's wealthy not to be able to live in the manner to which it's accustomed, and therefore to disgrace itself by not being able to maintain its previous opulent wealth. So there are frescoes in there by another Ghirlandaio, not the one from the Sassetti Chapel, but Ridolfo Ghirlandaio, of members of the Good Men of St. Martin, as they call themselves, distributing alms to these middle-classish sorts of people fallen on hard times. And that's already a really memorable thing to see on a very small scale. The quite surprising fact about the Borromini di San Martino is, small drum roll, it still exists. So when we go to see that, I will show you the letterbox style slot into which people to this day, Florentines, put donations for the shamefaced poor, because there are two secrets that have always existed in relation to the Borromini, which is that the membership is secret and the donations are secret, so that nobody gives away the identity of anybody involved, let alone the recipients. And it still operates. I mean, it's quite astonishing. So the idea of poveri vergognosi is still at work. There are still ancient families who have fallen on hard times. I suspect not as hard as generally poor people, but that is still something there which is designed to preserve the honor of families. And then, of course, Santa Croce, where you've got masterworks by Giotto, the Peruzzi family's chapel, the Bardi's family chapel, and many others. But there is where we see some of the canonical masterpieces of Giotto, and among his many other accomplishments and attributes is the fact that Giotto is the painter par excellence of the Franciscan brand of charity that I was talking about before. This is also a place where you want to be buried, closer, my God, to thee, as it were. It's the church to which you will leave donations to be distributed on your death as you try to buy back your soul in the afterlife, after a lifetime of having made money out of usury. Usury, again, still an issue in Italy. Usury is the profiting on interest. By the economics of this period, it's believed that there is a limited amount of money in the world. Of course, the economy isn't understood this way anymore. But the idea that if you lend money and then you charge interest for the loan, you are depriving people of money that would otherwise be available for them. So usury is a sin. Usury is a major sin. And unfortunately, the Renaissance and all of the art and the buildings and the architecture and all the glorious things we're going to see are built to some extent on this moral hazard. And so late in life, people they don't exactly get religion, because it's not possible to be anything other than pious in this period, but they get nervous. And so they
Mm,
make massive donations for rounds of masses, for charitable relief, for all sorts of things like that. That kind of donation can take the form of architectural patronage as well. So there you've got, in a way, Santa Croce as a gigantic, beautiful expression of the Franciscan ethic, and a kind of an irony, because it's the product of wealth. And of course, everybody knows that the Franciscan order is based on a vow of absolute poverty. So it stands there as a kind of conflict at the heart of the economic engine room of the Renaissance.
mm.
Um, and of course, Renaissance, which we tend to spell with a small r and a question mark at the end of it in all the syllabus descriptions, because, as I'm saying, Renaissance doesn't exist until Jacob Burckhardt.
You've alluded to the 19th century a few times. You alluded to it at the beginning when you were speaking about Burckhardt and how he really shaped our modern notion of the capital R Renaissance. And you also spoke about the 19th century when you were referring to Palazzo Davanzati, and how it was kind of, again, in a way, a 19th century reimagining of what the Middle Ages looked like, and, you know, how everyone can have medieval themed wallpaper with, you know, parrots or whatever the case may be. So you've referred to the modern age a few times, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, as is my job. And I was wondering, as we come towards the end of our time together for this chat, obviously you and I could chat about this for a lot longer than 1 hour, but let's keep ourselves restrained. You've lived in Florence as a modern city. You've spent quite an amount of time living in Florence at various times in your life. You've lived in Florence as a student with one kind of perspective, and you've lived in Florence as a visiting professor with another kind of perspective. And then you've been frequent.
In fact, with children going to the local primary school.
Yeah. So I just wondered, speaking of modern Florence and some of the challenges for people, you've referred to Venice a few times as well, challenges for people who live in these over-touristed cities like Florence and Venice. How do you see the modern city, the contemporary city of Florence? What's your perspective on that?
It's a difficult place to live if you're a local, and more people live on the periphery. So I have friends who live outside the city, and in the high season, they avoid going into the centre because of the football crowds, which is why we're going when we're going.
In November.
November is a much nicer time to be there. If you live there, it can be frustrating to live in. And Florence has a relatively recent history of, in a way, balancing the amenity of the place to keep it habitable and pleasant to visit, and screwing as much money as they can out of mass tourism. That is absolutely true. So it remains a glorious place. It is challenging in the center to live. But there's a lot. Florence is not just the centro storico, the historical center. It is not. And let me be very, very clear. If somebody offers me a small apartment with a rooftop view of the rest of the city in the middle, I'm taking it. So, okay.
You'll make a killing in rents alone, Nick.
Spread the word. No, I'll go and live there. No, I won't. There are reasons why I wouldn't do that. But I'm very happy here. But it's absolutely wonderful. But it's tough, I think, for locals to live in. Because so many of the major streets are filled with shops for tourists. Which is not to say you can't walk around the corner and find places that express the culture of the place as it has always been in the past. But for locals, it's difficult. Having said that, there are lots of developments around the edge, and let's be very, very clear. People live in a very sophisticated, attractive kind of existence in these places. And that one of the other things I was going to mention, glad I remembered to, is if there's another one thing I would like people to take away from a trip like this, in addition to their ability to read their way architecturally and spatially through a city, it's about the genius that Italians have for living in cities. I've long thought one of the study tours one should run is a study tour to places like Florence and Siena for town planners at state government and local government level who are allowed to do things to places like Melbourne and Sydney. Because
Hell of a junket.
there are a couple of thousand years of experience in what works in these places. So if you happen to go, when if you happen to, another place I like taking people is the Piazza del Campo in Siena. If you're standing on that space and feeling something you've never experienced before and wondering why people are bursting into tears because it's so beautiful, and that happens. You know, the Renaissance expression, man is the measure of all things. It's not just a cliche. Many of these early modern cities are designed on a human scale. They're places where you walk. Here's something I will talk a lot about to groups. Walking transforms everything so that you encounter things at ground level, one at a time, in spaces that accommodate groups of people in the ways you see them interacting. Sassetti Chapel, again, you can see a group of people. There's a photograph, inverted commas, in there of the Piazza Santa Trinita outside the door.
Yeah.
And it shows the miracle of a boy who's supposed to have fallen from a window in the Spini Palace, being rescued by divine intervention of St. Peter. And then you've got the aristocratic people, including members of the Medici faction. There's a man called Neri di Gino Capponi, whose portrait I will show people. And they're standing there discoursing on the street in these beautifully appointed spaces which work for the population, which negotiates on foot. Then, having bathed in that, you walk out on the piazza, and then they are.
I think that's why we love sitting around in squares initially with a glass of wine or something. They are spaces that work for human inhabitation. And I do feel, despite some of the problems Florence has, there are still the spaces in Florence, as you say, they're tending further and further to be out of the historic centre. But you still do get those experiences, I think, in Florence as well. I mean, I have drunk Florence Kool-Aid, but I do maintain this.
You can still cross the river and walk down to the left,
exactly,
down the Via dei Bardi, and you can come to a piazza inside the communal gate there, where tourists don't tend to go much. And there is
a wine bar there's a great wine bar in that school.
Antica Mescita di Vino, right?
There you go.
Yes, we will go there. So, but there are all sorts of pockets and places and so on, where the city survives, as it always has in many ways. And resilient has got to be the most overused word of the last decade, but these communities are resilient because, and I mean it, and I'll defend the word, the collective genius that this society has for inhabiting cities. So
yeah, I was there briefly in February, and I spent some time in your neighborhood, quite literally in the district of the Green Dragon, in the neighborhood where the Brancacci is, because in fact I wanted to go to the Brancacci Chapel. It's just reopened properly following another restoration, so I wanted to not climb a scaffold, but just have a look from a ground floor perspective. And I stumbled across a collective of women artisans on Borgo San Frediano, the kind of main thoroughfare of that neighborhood. And it's just a collective of women who live in Florence and work across various art forms and have formed their own gallery for displaying what they do and what they make, and they take turns to staff it as well. And yeah, I think resilient is a very overused word. But those kind of things, I think, show that spirit of the Renaissance, capital R, spirit of the Renaissance, still does live on in Florence in various ways, I think.
Oh, well, as we've mentioned in the itinerary, there are still picture framers and artisans of all kinds. And it's anecdotal, but this is a clue to the temperament and character of Bill Kent, that one of the first things he gave me on my first research trip was a book that Bill wanted me to use as a journal of my research and ideas. So a beautiful hardback little volume with nothing written in it, which I was to fill with my ideas and thoughts and so on, which he bought from a book bindery owned by a gay female couple, which is now in its second generation, and it's called Il Torchio. And the Torchio is the great big press that you use for bookbinding. And so I have been back there now for 40 years.
They're great.
And it's still the same little manufactory. There are dozens of these places. And so here's, as I didn't know I'd be speaking about it, but there's my...
But there it is, one you prepared earlier.
Yes, from Il Torchio. So it's not an accident that Daniel Day-Lewis went to learn shoemaking on the south side of the river in the area of the Green Dragon district. We haven't even said what Green Dragon and Red Lion mean. You know, these are old neighborhoods associated with the military companies that were trying to quell urban violence in the period of the early Tuscan commune. So when you walk around Florence and you see the words Comune di Firenze on the manhole covers, there's a history there too, because commune is political association of eligible, let's be honest, clear here, eligible males who can fill high office. And the commune, the existence of the commune, the present residences, are the evidence that you have not fallen into tyranny, because most Renaissance cities are in fact run by a strong arm merchant. And the exceptions are places like Venice, Siena, and Florence later takes over Siena, of course. So the powerful dominance of a prince is much more common in the Renaissance period than the survival of a communal republic like Florence, and they are so proud of it. And I will just add here that Florence, more particularly Venice, is where a lot of the ideas of the American Republic come from. It's an oligarchical republic. But the idea that there are councils which vote democratically, and put heavy inverted commas around the democratically, but the idea of a governing class that keeps at bay the tyrannical ambitions of a single person is enormously powerful. It's still deep in the DNA of Italian political life.
The continuity that you're kind of pointing to, and I am wrapping up, everyone, I am wrapping up, but I could keep chatting about this for quite some time. The continuity you're pointing to between kind of Florentine's past and present, I was really struck by that in February. One of the things your group is doing is a private tour of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in a big Michelangelo designed fortress that people might know from coming into the railway station at Florence. And it's a private tour that we're organizing just for your group, and I was extremely jealous. So when I was in Florence, because I had never been, when I was in Florence in February, they did an open day for the public. You had to be very fast, but a friend and I got on it, and we went and did that tour to see what it would be like for your group. And it was, you know, it was February. There was not we were the only non-Italian people in the group. And the questions that the people we saw a Giotto, a Fra Angelico being restored, obviously, for the upcoming exhibition, and a Spagnoletto work by Giuseppe de Ribera. And the questions that the Florentines in the group had for the restorer, because it's a restorer who gives the tour, the questions they had for her, their knowledge about the works of art that were being restored, the knowledge that they have of their own history and their own culture, and the interest that they have in it, and wanting to know how that outfit is funded, which was very interesting to hear about. I leave that for your group to learn how woefully underfunded they are. But it really impressed on me how that continuity is still there, that Florentines are so proud of the tradition they have. They recognize that during the season, as we would say, it's a difficult proposition, and it's not being handled particularly well. But out of the season, they're so proud to kind of expand into their city again. And yes, I was left with some jealousy for your experience in November. We're still having discussions in the office about how I might shoehorn myself onto that tour for no valid reason.
Well, I was lucky enough to go there. I was visiting professor at the Harvard Center in outside Florence, and they arranged, because there were connections between the two institutions, a group for 20 of us or so was organized. And I asked and was granted permission to bring my wife and my two children. They had giottos on stands being restored. So Kate, my wife, still talks about being able to bend over and smell the chemicals that were being used to restore the giotto. You could touch it. You didn't, but this is a treat to finish the tour, as is any visit to any exhibition. We've got the Fra Angelico one with the great Carl Brandon Strelka, who is one of the world's leading Renaissance historians of art in this period, and just a lovely person. So
another reason I'm jealous.
Yes, I think you need to come.
I do think I need to come. There's no valid reason for me to come because, as people will have gathered from our conversation, you absolutely know what you're doing, but I would dearly love to be there. It was an absolute pleasure working with you on putting the tour together. And Nick, thank you very much for coming along for a chat today. I forgot to say at the beginning that people could, of course, drop questions into the Q&A in the chat, but I'm sure people were listening to us while they went about making their dinner or folding their laundry, or I don't know, fixing something in their workshop. I'm sure people were listening rather than watching. So I did forget to tell you all, I'm sorry, that you could ask any questions. But if you have any questions for us, we'll be sending the recording out to you, so you can just reply to that email and ask any questions. Oh, here we go. There is a question, and that's but we have a question that I had questions, but they were answered during the talk. That question actually came from my mother. Thank you, Mum, for watching. That's lovely. There is a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, is the Bardi Chapel restoration finished? No, it wasn't in February, Elizabeth. So it was still undergoing when I was there in February, and it's Florence. So sadly, there is no date given for the end.
But we have invented a patron saint of restoration, haven't we? Santa Chiusa per Restauro. So,
she dogs us everywhere we go, sadly.
Saint closed for restoration, so you can.
but the Brancacci was back open. The Bardi was under restoration. What else was closed? Nothing else was closed in February. And some of you who may have visited in recent years may have found the baptistry in various states of restoration. That's coming to a conclusion. So thanks to the Nick's dropped the name of the patron saint of Italy, who, despite what you might think is neither St. Francis nor St. Clare, it's Santa Chiusa per Restauro. The Jubilee, of course, in Rome means that a lot of effort has been made throughout the country to bring sites back to a glowing status for in celebration of the religious Jubilee. So things are looking good in Florence. I'm going to wrap it up now, but I'm very jealous. I'll have to work on my non-existent reasons for joining you all in Florence, but I know that the people who are joining you are going to have a fabulous time with you in Florence.
And I look forward very much to meeting everyone.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone, for coming along. Thanks for coming to this first session. The next session, that is my other job. The next session will be held in about 1 month's time. We'll be sending out details shortly, and that is with Dr. Helen Pope, who'll be talking about a tour she's leading to a place she loves, which is Roman North Africa. So she'll be talking about Tunisia and Algeria. Bit of a change from what we were talking about today, Nick, but equally interesting. So Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Nick, for your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.